This lecture is on the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is a very important gland. There's a lot to talk about in this lecture. So the pituitary gland then is a small gland, and it is attached to the base of the brain. So I've drawn it out here. So this should be familiar to you now. I hope you studied the brain already. But the point is, here's the spinal cord, here's the medulla oblongata, the pons. We then get into the larger portion of the brain. At the back, you have the cerebellum, that thing that looks like a cauliflower when you dissect it. Up here, of course, all around here, we have the cerebrum. And here you have the corpus callosum, just for some landmarks. But what I'm getting at is that underneath the corpus callosum, which I have vastly overdrawn there, you have this area known as the thalamus. And I've only kind of briefly sketched in where the thalamus is. Now remember the language of A&P. Hypo means below or underneath or small or whatever. Here it means underneath, because here underneath the thalamus we have the hypothalamus. That's going to be very important. And then sort of hanging off the base of the brain on a tiny little stalk right underneath the hypothalamus is your pituitary gland. So there's the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is called the master gland sometimes. Because it controls the activity of so many other glands, as we will discuss. And it consists of two lobes, and they are the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So the part of the brain that is connected to the pituitary is called the hypothalamus. Again, here it is. Here's the hypothalamus, which is underneath the thalamus and above the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus then receives information from the nervous system. So this becomes very important here. And it also controls the release of hormones from the pituitary. So look at this. Here we have a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. This is really important. So this then is a very important link between the nervous and the endocrine system. So there's one of the places where the two systems talk. But the hypothalamus is also where the endocrine system talks to itself. So the hypothalamus then is also, that's an A, is also influenced by hormone concentrations in the blood. So this little piece of the brain then is getting information from the nervous system, but it's also getting information from the endocrine system, and it is talking to both the nervous and the endocrine systems. So it's incredibly important. So now we're going to get on to what happens in the pituitary gland. So the anterior lobe then of the pituitary, this secretes several different hormones. And many of these help to control the body's metabolism. And the hormones produced by the hypothalamus which are called releasing hormones or releasing factors. These then control the release of hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So as I said, this is fairly complex here. What you have going on here is we have the anterior lobe that secretes hormones, but in order to get those hormones released, the hypothalamus has to release some chemicals first. And the hypothalamus releases these chemicals known as releasing hormones or releasing factors, and it is those hormones from the hypothalamus which control the release of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. So I'm going to start now with the major hormones of the anterior pituitary. Now, before we do that, again, just to recap what I said over here. So we have hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and meanwhile, it's the hormones or the releasing factors produced by the hypothalamus here that then wind up influencing the release of these hormones. So the first hormone that I'm going to talk about from the anterior pituitary then is one you've already heard of, and that is the thyroid stimulating hormone, also known as TSH. So the thyroid stimulating hormone then, let's go over here for this. You've already heard about the thyroid stimulating hormone when I was talking about negative feedback cycles. So, the thyroid stimulating hormone then, and you already know this, stimulates the production and release of the other hormone in that feedback cycle called thyroxine, which is done by the thyroid gland. So thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the thyroid gland and then the thyroid gland secretes thyroxine. We've discussed this already when we were talking about negative feedback cycles. So another hormone then of the anterior pituitary is called, and this is a really long name here, adrenocorticotropic hormone, known as ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this stimulates the production and release of hormones from the cortex layer of the adrenal glands. And this hormone is sometimes used in the treatment of arthritis, asthma, and allergies. Okay, so from the cortex layer of the adrenal glands, it's therefore the name does tell you what's going on. Adreno for your adrenal glands, cortico meaning for the cortex then, and tropic basically means moving. So it's basically the hormone that gets the adrenal cortex to do something. And so it is the adrenocorticotropic hormone. A third hormone of the adrenal cortex, then, is growth hormone, or GH. So the short version of this is that it controls growth, but more specifically, it directly controls, or directly affects, I'll say, not controls, but it directly affects protein carbohydrate and fat metabolism, at a cellular level. But then growth hormone, we're still talking about growth hormone here. It also indirectly affects the growth of bone and cartilage. We're keeping going with the hormones of the anterior pituitary. There are a lot of them. So the fourth one then is follicle stimulating hormone, another one you have heard of already, known as FSH. And this, as you know, stimulates the development of egg cells in the ovaries of females. and in males. So we know about that function in females, but then in males, it controls the production of sperm cells in the testes. Still with hormones from the anterior pituitary, we also have luteinizing hormone, also known as LH. You've heard of this as well. This causes the release of egg cells from the ovaries in females. And it controls the production of sex hormones in both males and females. And then another hormone of the anterior pituitary, prolactin. And this stimulates the production of milk. After birth has taken place. So again, look at the word pro, as in favor of, and lact, as in lactation, as in milk. So prolactin tells you what it does. So now let's move on to the hormones of the posterior pituitary. Okay, so here we have something a little bit different. So there is a direct nervous connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And two hormones then are produced by nerve cells in the hypothalamus. And the hormones then pass down the axons. This is kind of amazing when you think about it. To the posterior pituitary. For storage and release. So this is kind of amazing when you think about it. Here you have, as I said, the hypothalamus at the base of the brain, just underneath the thalamus. Remember, thalamus, hypothalamus, and then hanging off the base of the brain, you have the pituitary gland. So, as I said, you actually have these hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. Then, I hope you remember what nerve cells look like, where you have the axon, which is that long, slender extension off of nerve cells. And so you wind up having these nerve cells in the hypothalamus making the hormones, and then those hormones basically drip more or less. They pass down that tiny extension of the neuron. The hormones are produced in the hypothalamus by nerve cells, and then the hormones pass down the axons of those nerve cells in order to get to the posterior pituitary, and then it's the posterior pituitary that releases them, but it may store them first. So let's get on to what those hormones are. So we're still talking about the posterior pituitary, and the two hormones that are produced this way then are, first of all, one called oxytocin. And this stimulates contractions of the smooth muscles of the uterus during childbirth. So this has been known for a long time because it's a very obvious, measurable physical effect that can be seen and noticed the causal connection. It also turns out that oxytocin does a great deal as what we will call sort of a bonding hormone. When oxytocin is released, it tends to make people want to bond. So it helps with the bond then between the mother and her infant, but oxytocin is also released when people cuddle, for instance. So it's this very sort of pleasurable, if you will, sort of warm, fuzzy feeling hormone, as well as having this obvious measurable effect on the uterus during childbirth. And the other hormone of the posterior pituitary that I'm going to talk about is vasopressin, which is also known as, and here's another big word, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And this controls the reabsorption of water by the nephrons. You remember nephrons, the nephrons of the kidney. Or of the kidneys, I'll put it that way. So antidiuretic hormone then is going to affect essentially how much water you keep in your body and how much water your kidneys allow to be released in the urine. And that is it for the hormones of the pituitary gland.